that Dru is going to speak to us. Dru is the former editor-in-chief here at Argosy and has gone on to do great things. She'll tell you about mainly being involved in co-founding and editing the Dominion, which is a co-op of journalists, news co-op, and CIS, which is the Center for International Studies here at Allison, has graciously made his talk possible today. And with that, I'm going to toss things over to Amanda Burton.
Hi there, my name is Amanda Burton, and I'm one of the student coordinators with CIS. CIS is a new project on campus, and it's in its second year, and it's a joint faculty and student organization that works on bringing academics outside of the classroom and applying them to concrete actions outside. So we are very happy to be partnering with the Argosy to bring you through today on humanitarian intervention and journalism, and to look forward to your talk.
Hi, just wanted to thank the Argosy for having me. Yeah, it's a great honor. It's been about 10 years since I was in the exact same position as John, editing as student journalist. So it was definitely one of the big adventures of my life to date. And if you'll pardon my brief moment of nostalgia, I will extend a very brief reflection, I guess, on that experience, by way of giving you a bit of advice, which is to say, to quote George Lakey, who's a great thinker on education and direct action, who says, he starts every workshop by saying, use everything for your advancement. And so, just thinking back on my experience at the Argosy, I think it's really important to think about everything, whether it's the sordid interpersonal conflicts or the moments of sublime cooperation and teamwork. All of that is just an incredibly fertile sort of learning experience. And I think there's something in every experience in a year as packed as the student journalism experience can be, to use everything for your advancement. I also wanted to acknowledge, as I'm in the habit of doing, that we're on traditional Big Mon territory. There's a long history of colonization in Canada, and quite a bit of the land is still First Nations land. So I just want to acknowledge that and urge people to get in touch with their history and understand what the people who still live here and what history has resulted in us being here on this particular bit of land now. And I'll leave it at that because that's not what my talk's about. I work with something called a media co-op. So there's some addresses there, Dru.ca, that's my personal website, has lots of links to stuff, and mediacoop.ca, which is the organization I work for, which publishes The Dominion, which is a newspaper, which I have copies of, which I'll pass out later. So I just wanted to start the talk by asking everyone to stand up, please. Thank you. And I was hoping that everyone could find someone who's nearby who you haven't spoken to before, ideally, or who you've spoken to the least, within practicality. And I want you to introduce yourself and say one good thing that Muammar Gaddafi has accomplished before dying.
Oh.
I understand that it's a little bit of a stretch of your imagination, perhaps, but I think the reasons for the exercise will become clear later, so go. Just like I mentioned. right, let's wrap it up. So thank you for that enthusiastic response. I'm going to try and leave as much time for discussion as possible at the end, so I'm just going to plow through my talk now. So who knows who this guy is? One person? Really? You? Anyone else? Say who it is. Who is it? Slobodan Milosevic. So have people heard that name?
Yeah.
Great. You can see I've got sort of a red background. This is your cue because he is the bad guy. Anybody know who this is? Far fewer, I would expect. His name is Franjo Tudjman. He was the president of Croatia. Milosevic was, of course, the president of the former Yugoslavia, then the Socialist Republic of Serbia, and various instantiations thereafter. They were both elected, although this guy is much more likely to be referred to as elected, whereas Milosevic is more likely to be referred to as a dictator. So I've given him a green background because he's a good guy. So here's a few things that people have said about Milosevic. He's the butcher of the Balkans. You'll see this everywhere. I don't know, has anyone seen this? Yeah. Okay, so this is pretty common knowledge that he's the butcher of the Balkans. John Stewart, just in passing really, wasn't making an argument. He was just saying, as a matter of fact, that he's a madman. He's a genocidal maniac. Bill Clinton called him a new Hitler. Tudjman, he's a tough old buzzard. He's the father of Croatia. And generally we don't hear about him at all. But he was one of the West's main allies, one of NATO's main allies during the Yugoslavian War, which lasted from basically an entire decade of the 1990s. So the only thing that's missing from this complete consensus about Milosevic are facts. So this is just an excerpt from a report from John Laughlin, a British journalist, who was covering the entire time Milosevic was on trial for war crimes. He said, the trial has heard from more than 100 prosecution witnesses, and not a single one has testified that Milosevic ordered war crimes. So on the one hand, there's an abundance of, like, everybody knows that Milosevic is a war criminal. And I'm not saying he's not, maybe he is. But despite the fact that everybody agrees on this, there's remarkably little evidence. If you actually read any story about Milosevic's death, you'll see those kinds of phrases: Hitler, war crimes, genocidal maniac, all kinds of things like that you'll see, but very, very seldom will you actually see any evidence quoted to that effect. Which is not to say it doesn't exist, but to say this, it's just not talked about. One thing that is quoted often is a speech that he gave on the 600th anniversary of the Serbian defeat in Kosovo. So that was 1389. And Serbians talk about this day as if it's yesterday. It's a really big deal in Serbia. And in this speech, it's often cited as him taking a turn toward nationalism and of a particularly ugly variety. And the speech is constantly cited as being his turn toward nationalism, and when he turned into a genocidal maniac, when he was really the guy who whipped up the nationalist fervor and started all these wars in the former Yugoslavia. So here's an excerpt from that speech, which you can read the whole thing online. So he says, "Today, more than in the past, members of other peoples and nationalities also live in Serbia. This is not a disadvantage for Serbia. I am truly convinced that it is its advantage. Citizens of different nationalities, religions, and races have been living together more and more frequently and more successfully." So he's advocating for multiculturalism, basically, in this speech that's constantly cited. Of course, they don't actually quote anything in the speech, because you'd have to quote stuff like this, which doesn't quite jive with the whole rabid nationalist identity. It was considered nationalist within the context of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, where nationalism is completely taboo. But the most nationalist thing he says in it is, long live Serbia, long live Yugoslavia. Which is, I think we can all agree, pretty tame compared to some of those things. So let's contrast this with some of the things that Tudjman has said, which consequently are never mentioned anywhere. The establishment of Hitler's new European order can be justified by the need to be rid of the Jews. He wrote this in a book that he published in the 80s. Genocide is not only permitted, it is recommended, even commanded by the word of the Almighty, whenever it is useful for survival or restoration of the kingdom of the chosen nation, or for the preservation and spreading of its one and only correct faith. So, there's debate about how much these quotes are taken out of context, but if we were trying to demonize Tudjman, it would be a lot easier anyway. But we're not, because he's our ally. See the green? There can be no return to the past, to the times when Serbs were spreading cancer in the heart of Croatia, a cancer that was destroying the Croatian national being. He said that last bit at a crucial moment, which was after the largest ethnic cleansing operation of the entire Yugoslavian war, which NATO actually supported. So, Operation Storm happened in 1995. It was ordered by Tudjman. He was never prosecuted for war crimes, although some Croatians were later on. So 250,000 Serbs were ethnically cleansed, just removed from Croatia. They never actually returned. It's the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of houses were torched. There were all kinds of documentation of mass rapes. Really, really gruesome stuff. Which is all not to say that the Serbs didn't do the same thing during the war, but we just never heard about this. We heard about the Serbs, and we tended to hear quite exaggerated, often based on no evidence accounts of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was Operation Storm. I'll just keep moving on. NATO supported it. Canada, naturally part of NATO. So because Croatia was Canada's ally at this point, effectively we were supporting this operation. So NATO had a pretty crucial role in this. They bombed all the anti-aircraft emplacements that were within Croatia, jammed communications in the Serbian area of Croatia, known as Krajina. We jammed communications, and NATO was constantly facilitating the transfer of arms and technical training and so on to Croatia, which is, again, our ally in that war. A few years later, about 3 years later, NATO bombed the living heck out of Serbia. This was justified on various grounds, one of which was the non-existent genocide that was supposedly happening. There were definitely massacres, there were definitely atrocities on all sides happening in this, what was by all accounts a gruesome civil war. But at the time, the propaganda went above and beyond that. It went, the Secretary of State, I believe, of the US told the press that hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians were missing, implying that they had been massacred or some were in mass graves, something like that. And this is where the new Hitler stuff comes in. These kinds of claims were made, and then they very quickly diminished. So first it was hundreds of thousands, then it was tens of thousands, then it was okay, actually there are 2,000 people who are unaccounted for. What was happening was that Serbia was undertaking a counterinsurgency campaign, very similar, in fact, to what Canada is doing today in Afghanistan, which is to say that there were some terrorist elements or freedom fighters, however you want to, whoever side you're taking, they were bombing Serb houses, they were attacking various targets, because there are a lot of ethnic Serbs that live in Kosovo. Anyway, as soon as I start to explain the actual war, it gets out of control, so I'm going to try and keep that to a minimum. But just to focus on the propaganda, the numbers went from hundreds of thousands to thousands, but it got the silence, or the volume with which these numbers were proclaimed decreased with the number of victims that was being claimed. So you had hundreds of thousands, headlines, big headlines, New York Times, potential genocide, we need to do something, oh God, let's bomb. Then later on it was like, oh, well, maybe there wasn't, maybe it was just a couple thousand. And that was definitely not trumpeted, certainly nothing was done to correct that. And so you have a sort of interesting journalistic technique where you will talk about Milosevic being the genocidal maniac, even though all the evidence that was being previously mobilized to make that case has disappeared. You can still do it because it's been established. So anyway, NATO bombs, 20,000 tons of bombs were dropped over in 72 days. Refugee camps were bombed, hospitals, schools, major industrial installations were bombed, water treatment plants were bombed, sewage plants were bombed, massive chemical spills, thousands of barrels of oil and various other chemicals were released into the Danube because they bombed chemical plants and refineries. About 80,000 barrels of oil were incinerated in Beograd and Belgrade, so in a highly populated area. Depleted uranium was used, cluster bombs were used. We know the problems with these things. So this what I'm talking about now is the humanitarian intervention. This was done to stop the genocide that was going on in Yugoslavia. I would like to make the case that military humanitarian intervention doesn't exist. Whenever there's a war, there's a reason for the war, and that reason is usually not moral. Almost never, in fact. Really hard to find actual examples of that. I'd also like to propose a definition of humanitarian intervention. Telling the truth, not telling lies. Pretty simple. But this has to be done vigorously, and it has to be done against the current of the collective consciousness that tends to be mobilized whenever we need a war. Because when you have a war, you need to justify it. You need to have a reason for it. So a good reason might be hundreds of thousands of people are missing. Certainly, if that was the case, one might say, yes, it is justified to do certain things. Perhaps not bombing schools, perhaps not bombing hospitals, but you could say that something should be done. When in fact, it's not happening, we might be able to say that dropping 20,000 tons of bombs on Serbia might not be a good thing, might be damaging, might not be humanitarian at all, might actually really kill a lot of people and make a lot of people miserable for decades to come, which is the case in Serbia. I'd also like to make the case that if the Canadian media had told the truth and said, oh, Tudjman is this guy, for better or for worse, I mean, he's sympathetic with the Ustaše who killed hundreds of thousands of people during World War II in one of the biggest genocides outside of Germany. You know, he's actively mobilizing that part of the Croatian population and legitimizing that history. He's making fairly hate-filled genocidal statements himself. But despite all that, he's our ally because for the following reasons. So we could have a rational discussion about it. That's not what happened. It was considered unpalatable for the Canadian public to know who our allies actually were. And so, we just don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone knew who Tudjman was. I'm just going to blast through it and then we can talk about it later. So I'm just going to let George Orwell do a little speaking for me. And I'll move on. War against the foreign country only happens when the money classes think they're going to profit from it. George Orwell said it, not me. I want to, with due respect, and I do mean that sincerely, to our friend Mr. Mansbridge, Chancellor of Allison University, I would like to take a slightly critical approach to some of his reporting. Let's just show you a quick little clip, which I would argue is part of the problem.
Wait, now. Canadian fighter jets were part of the air offensive over Libya today, but despite having a plan of attack, they didn't strike. Why not? Jean-Francois Bélanger is of the coalition command
single shot. The pilots decided not to strike the ground targets that were assigned, thinking the risk for collateral damage was too high, despite their high-precision laser-guided bombs. After all, the operation's goal is to protect civilians. That's what Lieutenant Colonel Sylvain Minard kept in mind when he flew the first Canadian mission over Libya. That, and the reports he see on TV about what Gaddafi did to his own people.
We are really proud and really motivated to be part of this role. Obviously, we are here to defend Canada's moral values and ethical values, human rights, democracy.
This is the first time CFA teams have been sent on a combat mission abroad since Kosovo in 1999.
To my knowledge, it's the first one that we deployed that rapidly from the time that we have the go and we're in situ, and that we actually can do operations very quickly. The way we have demonstrated, it's the first time that it does happen.
Fighter jets are operating under international command alongside American, British, and French planes. The crash of an American F-15 earlier in the day serves as a clear reminder of just how dangerous the mission is.
While we can't eliminate risk in operations such as this completely.
Alright. So I'm going to go on a limb and say that that is propaganda, and I'm just going to move on. Within five years, I think, 5 or 6 years of Operation Storm, which was, again, the largest ethnic cleansing program undertaken since, in the entire Yugoslavian war. Very little reported in Canadian press. Croatia had the discussion. Croatia was and it was a very difficult discussion to have because, you're living in a tiny country, the size of smaller than Nova Scotia, I think. But don't quote me on that. Having a discussion where, there's really, really strong divisions, and the people most of the people who took part in this operation likely to be your next door neighbor kind of thing. But they were able to muster the self-critical impulse and say, we're going to show a documentary that shows pretty much the full extent of the horrors visited on the 250,000 ethnic Serbians who we kicked out of Croatia, and the thousands who were killed. We're going to show this on national TV during prime time, and we're going to have a national debate about it. It did take a year or two, I think, for them to do it. They were I think there were some comments from the Croatian national TV station being yeah, we'd show it, but we really don't want people to fire rockets into our office building. So, but they did it. Despite that kind of level of tension, they were able to show it. They had a massive debate. They had parliamentarians weighed in on this. All kinds of different people weighed in on these atrocities been committed by basically themselves. Less than 5 years before, they were able to have a self-critical discussion about it. And after this discussion, when they polled, they said 75% said whoever responsible for these crimes should be tried in some kind of tribunal. Canada is unable, for some reason, to muster the critical faculties to look at the war crimes committed in our name. There were a few lawyers actually from Toronto who filed a 100-page legal brief to the International Tribunal for war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, saying, Canada took part in the bombing. I think a large percentage, I can't remember the exact percentage, of the bombs were dropped by Canadian planes. They had the following impacts. These are the kinds of things that were bombed. Therefore, Canada took part in war crimes, and we would like to indict Jean Chrétien, who was head of state at the time, not head of state, but in command of the armed forces, for war crimes. That was rejected just outright. What's more, I can't imagine in Canada a documentary about the real impacts of the bombing being shown on prime time. Just wouldn't happen. And so I'd just like to ask why. I think it has a lot to do with the fragile but also extremely powerful mythology that Canada has about itself. Whenever there are atrocities or terrible things happening in Libya and Haiti and Yugoslavia and Afghanistan, the question is always, what can we do? What I like to say is that question is based on an assumption. The assumption being that we're not actually already doing something, and furthermore that anything that we're already doing is 100% to the good and benevolent. So what I'd like to ask people to do, collectively, Canada, maybe just this room, is to take the Hippocratic Oath, to say, let's take a critical approach to what we're already doing, and first try to eliminate the harm that we're doing in the world. And then, after that, maybe we can talk about how we can help people out. What happened was that the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which represented the minority Tutsis, invaded the country and started a war during which many atrocities were committed, some of which could even be considered by some to be genocide, or genocidal in their approach. Their explicit goal was, as a minority, to take over the country and conquer it, basically, because they had been excluded from power. And there had, of course, been abuses by the majority government. It's a very complicated situation, but the fact is, there was a military invasion, armed by the U.S. The leader was trained in the U.S. With, obviously, government approval and support. All this happened in the lead up to the genocide, and was much of the justification. There's no justification for genocide, obviously, but was much of what mobilized people to be so vicious in that conflict. During that whole time, when they were preparing for the invasion, mobilizing support for the invasion, doing the actual invasion, committing atrocities during the invasion, there's very little talk in Canada. It wasn't really on anyone's radar. And there's a really interesting interview with Judy Kahn, who is the foreign correspondent for La Presse, which is one of Quebec's fairly well-respected dailies, who just retired recently. But I did a couple of interviews with him because he's so full of incredible knowledge that, really no one else seems to be talking about. And he's written he's got an amazing body of work. So I urge you to check him out. It's all in French, but except for the interview. But this is what he said about the invasion of Rwanda and why it wasn't prevented. It's because the media did not raise a hue and cry. That's the main reason. Had it been the other way around, where our interests were being threatened, there would have been no negative reporting on the RPF's invasion of Rwanda. And one might argue, no invasion, no genocide. It might have still happened, but seems to me, based on the historical criteria or the historical evidence, to be much less likely. The whole thing was sparked when the RPF shot down the plane that was carrying the current president, right?
Is that confirmed that it's them that shot it down? I thought that was kind of wobbly. Or they say it's wobbly. I don't know.
Yeah. I'll give you that it's wobbly.
Yeah.
It's disputed, certainly. Yeah. So, I'll step back one step on that. So this is Paul Martin meeting with Muammar Gaddafi not very long ago. I won't say much about Libya. I've got some links to further reading online, so I'll let that sort of do the talking. But all the justifications for the war against Libya, very few of those justifications have actually turned out to be factual. There were a lot of claims made about, like Obama made a speech where he said, there's going to be massive massacres, there's going to be a genocide, there's going to be this, there's going to be that. If they take Tripoli, it's going to be the end of the world. We can't let that happen. He's a madman. He's going to kill everyone. We have to stop it. And the only choice is to intervene militarily right now to stop it. As with many interventions, like I was talking about Yugoslavia, it's the exact same thing. All those big numbers sort of just wither away. They're repeated very loudly by journalists at the time, but you won't find any journalists being like, oh, it was true that Gaddafi had bombed civilians peacefully protesting. He had promised to come after the people who rose up against him, which is exactly what the Canadian government does, exactly what the American government does, exactly what every government does when people take up arms against it. But no evidence of the atrocities that he was. That's not to say that he's not a murderous, torturing, autocratic, freedom-hating, egotistical asshole. But he was that in this photo too.
Yeah.
And when Canadian companies, some of the major Canadian companies were making billions, deals worth billions of dollars, Suncor made deals worth billions of dollars with Gaddafi, so did SNC-Lavalin, that's what Paul Martin was there doing. Basically, Paul Martin met with Gaddafi and then those deals were signed, so maybe there's a connection, I don't know. One thing I do want to mention is that, I had it, but there was a big report. No, I don't have it. There's a big report in the Golden Mail, multi-page reporting about this, about Gaddafi's death, naturally, yesterday. Interestingly, I didn't see a single mention in the whole thing of the major Canadian interests. Certainly one would imagine there might be some acknowledgement that there are billions of dollars at stake, and what does this mean for those companies? Nothing. And today there's a lot of gushing. I have the paper over there, maybe I'll bring it up for question and answer, but there's a lot of gushing today about how wonderful, how wonderful this intervention was, and how it really shows that Harper, his gamble paid off, and we're stopping these evil dictators from attacking their own people. Which is just not true on many different levels, which is very evident in the case of Canada and the coup d'etat that was carried out in Haiti. In this case, there was, Haiti in 2 minutes. There was a democratically elected government in Haiti, overwhelmingly democratically elected, had overwhelming popular support. Some armed gangs started rampaging around the countryside, created a crisis. The US, France, and Canada sent troops to ostensibly mitigate this crisis. In the process, ended up kidnapping the elected president and removing the entire elected government. I know you don't believe me, but I'll show you some books later that you can read about this, because it's simply, it doesn't make any sense. But within the context of Canadian mythology. Removed thousands of elected officials, replaced the entire government with not only a government that wasn't elected, but a government that went about systematically targeting and killing and imprisoning the people who were activists for the majority political party, which is known as Famille Lavalas. And the RCMP was right there in the middle of it. During this whole thing, they were vetting former members of the hated, feared, murderous former Haitian military who were being integrated into the National Police Force, who were then going around killing thousands of people based on multiple reports, including one in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. Imprisoned many other thousands more went into hiding. Talking about a systematic campaign of political repression. It's like if in the mid-90s, Haiti had sent a military force to Canada, taken Jean Chrétien, who was getting successive majorities, taken him out of power, taken all the MPs out of power, and also taken all the provincial liberals out of power, put them in jail, gone around shooting liberal. It doesn't make any sense. It's unfathomable in the Canadian context. But this did happen. And the whole time the media was silent. Nothing. In the lead up, they did a great deal to legitimate the eventual overthrow of Jean-Bertrand Aristide by saying that there were problems with his democracy, which actually referred to Senate elections where 8 senators out of a massive majority were elected with a plurality. The Organization of American States, the U.S., they all signed off on this election, but then they realized that they didn't actually want him in power, and so all of a sudden the election was flawed. He was anti-democratic by not having these 8 senators have a runoff election where they would have to, get a majority, a clear majority. Aristide actually asked them to resign, and they did, and then there were new elections. That still wasn't enough. It was too late. Aristide's commitment to democracy was clearly not good enough. And so the Canadian military went in, secured the airport. The RCMP came in, started training the Haitian National Police, and Canadian officials dismissed all the human rights reports from the University of Miami, the University of Harvard, and the Lancet as propaganda. The Globe and Mail actually, despite the total lack of reporting about Haiti, went on the attack. Not actually, like their reporting that was attempting to discredit the Lancet report actually was much more prominent and more in-depth than their reporting of the initial report itself, which is pretty interesting. So I'm going to wrap up there. I would like to argue that the task of journalists and also citizens is to reject categories of good and evil because they're not very useful. I think the whole good guy, bad guy thing at the beginning sort of made a mockery of that, I'm hoping. I think we need to look at the actual interests, the actual facts on the ground, what's going on. I think we're very far from that. The fact that we can pick up, there can be hundreds of column inches of coverage about Libya without any mention of Canada's corporate interests, I think is really indicative. I mean, not just minor corporate interests, but like billions and billions of dollars of investment. I think that if there was ever even going to be conceived of a humanitarian intervention, it has to be based on reality. It can't be based on fantasy. And right now, much of the foreign reporting that happens in Canada is based on fantasy. If you're a journalist, what this means is that you have to work your ass off. You have to, I think a lot of people are really good and well-intentioned. I've talked to journalists who went to Haiti and did all kinds of reporting that was quite flattering to these rebels that were saying that Aristide's a dictator. They were saying all this stuff. Later on, sort of figured out what was happening, figured out how their view of the situation had been completely circumscribed and limited, and actually started writing critical stuff about it. Very quickly, they were, Sue Montgomery from the Gazette, for example, will never be sent back to Haiti. And she can sneak in the occasional piece in like the review section or something. She reviewed Peter Hallward's Damming Flood, which is an excellent book about this whole situation. Anyway, my point is you have to work harder than everyone else because you have to actually go and figure out what the situation is on the ground. You have to look at these contradictory accounts, and then you have to figure out, you have to compare the two. You have to be like, oh, so the Serbian supporters say this, but the Croatians say this, and how does that jive? And then you have to spend a lot of time figuring out where the blind spots are and where the omissions are, and then just check a lot of facts. It's really difficult, but I think it's also really important and really necessary because thousands of lives are at stake. And I think we have to get rid of Canadian mythology of the benevolent country. I don't think it does anyone any good. I think it's a deviation from reality. I think that we can, as Canada, I think we can figure out how to be self-confident enough not to have these myths, and we can actually look at what's actually going on, and then make much better informed decisions about where we're going. So this is me. I'm good guy. Just so you know. If you have any questions, then you can do. If anyone wants to talk about Gaddafi, that's cool. Go ahead.
In response to your little talk, or your piece in your talk about the issue with Croatia, what would you say about the Medec pocket inquiry and the news pieces that came out of that situation and the back and forth that happened between Canada and the Croatian government?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, I mean, I would agree with you that we need to think more about what Canada's role is, but there was an actual inquiry into Canada's relationship with Croatians. In the Medec pocket, Canadian Forces personnel serving as UN peacekeepers were shot at by Croats because they were going to kill Serbs. And the Canadian Forces went in afterward and saw the massacres that happened by Croatian.
I don't doubt that. And I definitely came across, I didn't come across that, but I came across testimony by Andrew Leslie, where he basically, when they convicted some of the Croatian generals in the ICTY, he testified to the effect that they had been in charge and committed these massacres. So yeah, it's not clear cut at all. I mean, some of the Canadian generals on the ground have quite a nuanced and critical understanding of what's going on. Mackenzie, for example, is huge advocate for the Afghanistan war, but has a very, I mean, he was on the ground, so he has quite a critical understanding that's much more nuanced than a lot of stuff that shows up in the Canadian press. I don't think he would call Milosevic a new Hitler, for example. But he would, but his that's not what defines the debate, right? Like it's not the view of, like, I mean, I haven't seen any coverage of this, but it definitely makes sense that kind of inquiry happened. Why wasn't it, a larger deal than it was? I don't know. Well, I do know because it overall the narrative arc that we want to have is that, well, it was Serbia's fault. They started the war. They committed the major massacres, and they're the major war criminals. That's the narrative arc that still needs to be maintained to this day. Yeah.
How do you find the direction of public opinion? As the first the Occupy Wall Street protest began, and actually a lot of newspaper and press doesn't pay that much attention to them. And actually, there's comparison between the New York Times and CNN, and we can see the interview with the protestant, and could somehow we can kind of see the perspective of that press as the way they try to interview with them. Like the CNN, they kind of the phrase "you never know, hard to know, who know, you don't know, and I don't know either." That kind of phrase like being used a lot of time as the CNN interviewing with the protestants. So how do you see the direction of public opinion? Because it could apply to.
So just with regard to the Occupy protest?
You could take that as an example, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that public opinion is often based on the facts that people have available to them. And I think that especially with the Occupy protest, I think what we saw was that people had access to a different set of facts than was being presented in the corporate media for the first couple weeks. And that's what allowed the protest to grow to the point where the corporate media had to cover it. And then, as John Stewart put it, they turned the dial from blackout to circus. And then all of a sudden you have all this coverage. I mean, still a lot of it's like really sort of not very good and critical in ways that don't make any sense, but it's still.
We're talking about like humanitarian interference of mass media.
Yeah.
So do you think like the mass media can somehow influence the direction of public opinion, which actually it shouldn't be that way, however it's kind of being led or something like that?
Can the mass media slide, because I anticipated sort of people asking about why journalists aren't covering it, and it's really complicated to figure out. A lot of it has to do with what sources they have access to, and a lot of it has to do with the funding of the papers they write for, namely major advertisers, which major corporations. Also comes out to who's the owner, and the sort of ideological selection process that happens. I've read books about by Canadian journalists where they talk about, it's not that you get fired when you say stuff that's critical, it's that you don't get promoted. And so by the time you get up to foreign correspondent, which is a fairly sort of prestigious position, you end up with people who are very ideologically formed in terms of towing these kinds of lines, and they're fairly aware that they're not allowed to deviate from that line. Yeah.
Just one point on that is, having worked in a newspaper where a lot that actually has a pretty healthy foreign correspondent.
Yeah.
The irony is a lot of the foreign correspondents are actually some of the younger people in the newsroom.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't probably, I don't know how ideologically formed they are, but it doesn't really, like, it's very difficult to get promoted anyway in newspapers. There's not like a hierarchy going.
Yeah.
So often the people who end up getting to foreign bureaus get there pretty early in their career because they're kind of unfettered.
Sure.
And like it's kind of just as a bit of a reality check there.
Sure. I got in a big fight with Mark McKinnon online about this. Like, for example, he's like been a foreign correspondent for the Globe and Mail for a long time, and
Since he was about 26.
yeah, exactly. So we published a critique in the Dominion about his reporting. He got really mad at us, and then we had a kind of an extensive back and forth. At which point we agreed to disagree, basically. But all it's to say that if you look at his book, for example.
Well, I'm not talking about Mark or his book. I'm just saying like that.
No, it's one example.
The scenario you're painting
Yeah.
is not consistent with the reality of how newsrooms get formed and promoted. And
Okay. Well, what I would say is that what comes out the other end speaks for itself in terms of people don't even know who Tujman is, right? Much less that like NATO was backing him during this time. For example.
I'm just saying that there's very little evidence in my experience of people getting promoted. Well, it's a very flat organization. There's not a lot of promoting going
Yeah,
on.
I'm just quoting a Canadian journalist who was writing in Saskatchewan, I believe, at the time, and that's what he said about how you move up.
Okay, well, that's worth pointing out.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else?
Yeah, just to reference last night, one of the answers from Peter Mansbridge was that when you get all these stories, you have to prioritize, you have to determine what's most important, what's most relevant to the viewers. So if you have a case like Libya, and you're just getting this news that the government is saying, we need to address this, and here are the reasons that we're going to tell you. But then you have somebody else, a reporter out there saying, look, there are other motivations here, there are other ways of looking at this that the government isn't wanting you to say.
Yeah.
Peter Mansbridge's response to things like that are pretty much like, well, one is news, another is speculation. That these are things that we can't put on the news and say, well, this one person thinks that there are interests here that are also motivating the government. And you really can't put that in the middle of primetime CBC and say, well, this one person is suggesting this.
Well, sure, I'm sure you can. If you're covering Canadian involvement in Libya, certainly a part of that picture is not the speculation, but the established facts that, like, Suncor has billions of dollars invested in refineries and oil extraction in Libya. Or that the RCMP is training the Haitian National Police in Haiti, and here's what these human rights reports say, and here's what these eyewitness reports say. Like, all those things are real facts. Like, they're not speculation, but they're not covered, right?
Exactly. So then are you suggesting that this is the reason why they're saying, well, this is just speculation, we can't print this, or show this on primetime, is because of the Canadian mythology, or is there something else?
There's a lot of dynamics. It comes down to this kind of thing. It's not what the talk's about, but I try to get into it. Basically, I don't know, really. I think a lot of it has to do with what sources are available, how hard journalists have to work. I think a lot of journalists are well-meaning, like the guy who was reporting from he probably means well. He's probably just like, okay, I got sent to hang out with these Canadian Air Force types, and that's who I have access to, right? I'm not in, I'm not, behind the other lines. I'm not in Tripoli. I'm not even in Benghazi. I'm on the Air Force base, and so that's who I'm going to interview. But the fact that that's consistently the kind of reporting that we see lots of, and then we see no reporting from, like, one could investigate, for example, how many civilian casualties have resulted from NATO bombs. Maybe it's zero, but I haven't heard that. I haven't heard anything. I don't know, because that's not something that anyone sees fit to put journalistic resources into. Yeah.
Reporting is hard work, and it takes resources.
Yeah.
And it's not going to happen if the resources aren't devoted.
Yeah.
And so what you have are reporters who are essentially stenographers. They will read a press release from the government and publish it as fact when it's just an assertion by someone who has an interest. In order to find out the facts, you have to do investigative work. And if you work for an organization that doesn't fund that, you're not, that's why the stuff that is speculation should be followed up and then reported as reporting of facts.
Yeah, well, it's either fact or it's not fact.
That's right, but you have to investigate that. That's the job of an investigative reporter. It's not being a stenographer.
Yeah, and I think Mansbridge point's well taken. In that case, it's like, yeah, there's very few resources. If the CBC was funded at 4 times the current rate, probably they would have better reporting, no question. But would it also be shaped by ideology? Of that I have no doubt as well, because there are other forces in terms of, what people choose to present. Like, clearly, despite the fact that Canada has a central role in Haiti, one columnist who had a private correspondence with a colleague of mine simply said, Haiti has been taken off the table as a subject for debate for some reason. Probably because it makes Canada look terrible. Because not only do we overthrow a democratically elected government, but we're training the people who were confirmed to be committing massacres all over the place, and a campaign of systemic political repression. So, yeah.
I was curious about what you feel the purpose of the, I don't know the best way to describe it, but the non-mainstream media, so co-ops and that sort of.
Yeah.
What is their role? Is it to change the way mainstream media reports, or is it rather to just carve a niche for yourself in the grander news world?
I look at it as doing journalism the way it should be done. Obviously, when you have like supremely limited resources, that's not a goal that you realize, but it's a goal you aspire to, and that's certainly what I aspire to. Is to have critical journalism that shows a full range of debate, that actually shows the full range of facts that are relevant to any given situation. In the case of, I think a lot of alternative media, what they do is because, doing that sounds good, but really what you're trying to do is tilt against the wind of the prevailing sort of reporting. And so you end up focusing in on a much more selective set of facts, and really just like hammering those, or like series of stories. So like, for example, whereas we would love to talk about in a holistic way about what's going on in Haiti, what we do is we go and talk to, grassroots activists who are being repressed, or who are in jail, under this Canadian-backed regime, or quote them about the elections that Canada is now promoting as being this big, like, wonderful democratic process, but in fact it's like supremely flawed. Yeah.
But the basis of what you're doing, a lot of it is pointed at sort of a critical way of looking at the mainstream media. Do you want to change how the mainstream media does reporting?
I want to understand it, and I think understanding suggests a lot of changes. I don't think that you can just change the way people do reporting. I think there are structural reasons for why Haiti had a total blackout across all Canadian media outlets. Let's be honest, like, there were very, very small numbers of stories that even hinted at what was going on. So that's a structural problem. That's not an individual problem. So yeah, I want to change it for sure. But I want to change the underlying structure that leads to that situation. And that's a problem of ownership, of corporate advertising, of, sources of cynicism, a lot of things. But mostly it's money, I would say. It's where how the resources get allocated.
Alternative media is available though, so like what would be the difference between putting it on primetime news and having it available on the internet? That's exactly, it's just as easy to turn on the TV and watch primetime news as it is to find alternate media sources on the internet. So do you not think like pushing to put it on primetime, would that even make a difference because it's already available?
I definitely think it would make a difference. Yeah. The number of viewers you can access and the amount of credibility you get from putting something on the CBC is just no comparison between that and the media co-op. I mean, there's lots of stuff on the media co-op, but it's news stories every day, most of which get ignored. And we do our best to promote them, obviously. But
do you think that people are critically? Do you think that people will actually look at it critically because they're so ingrained in like these ideas that have been pushed on?
Look at the corporate media critically?
Well, no, like viewers in general. Do you think that they would see all these new ideas? Let's say that you put alternative media onto the CBC.
Yeah.
Do you think that they would actually do that critically, or would they just continue to follow propaganda?
Well, it would be propaganda at that point because there would be a range of debate, right? If you had, pro-airspeed Haitian activists on CBC being interviewed, giving their side of the story, and then you had pro-coup people who were like, well, the Haitian, justifying what the Haitian National Police are doing on CBC, debating them, then people can make their own decisions, right? But we don't have that. We don't have that debate. It's non-existent. Anyone else? Anyone want to share anything good they can think of about Gaddafi?
The Globe's got a couple of stories on Sackville and Libya.
Oh yeah, no, I'm aware that there are a number of stories on them. That's actually where I get my news. Is the business section has actually pretty good coverage. I was just referring to the multi-page section yesterday on Gaddafi's death, right, where generally there will actually be quite a divide between. I read the business section because that's actually where you get a lot of the good info, especially about stuff like the tar sands mining companies. That's not seen as relevant to the public at large, but is obviously very relevant to people who are investors and stuff. So I'm not there. I would never deny that there has been coverage, but I think if you look at it, you'll find that like 90% of it's in the business section, if not 100%.
It's different than if there's no.
Well, the claim I made was there was no coverage in that multi-page thread. Yeah.
Do you want it? I think is this it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Just read out here.
Yeah, just read a quick excerpt from that. Well, one thing about Gaddafi is that he's quite handsome. It's actually interesting because in today's Golden Mail, they have a big thing on Canada's role in the world, and it's pretty interesting because it's like basically it's two threads. One is how wonderful the military intervention in Libya was, and then the other one is how we're on the cutting edge of like making like ethical trade in diamonds, for example. I just want to read this one excerpt. This is by John Ibbotson and Daniel LeBlanc today on page A3. Prime Minister Stephen Harper demonstrated his willingness to put military forces on the front line in support of collective action against governments that become a menace to their own people. Which I think is pretty rich. I mean, given that Ibbotson was just sort of twiddling his thumbs while the Haitian government with full Canadian backing had become a menace to its own people, for example.
Well,
yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dru, for coming and speaking today, and again, thanks to CIS for all your attendance and discussion as well, and thank you again for supporting this venture with the Argosy. We really appreciate it. Do you want to announce if there's a CIS meeting coming up, or for all of us to know about, or anything like that?
Atlas mini conference is next week on Saturday as well.
well. If you guys are interested in any of the upcoming CIS events for this semester, you can go to cismta.ca, and there's a full newsletter on there with all the events that will be coming